My name is Daniel, and the night I realized I was invisible was the same night the entire company raised their glasses in a holiday toast. Here's to another flawless year of uptime. Our lead sales guy cheered, champagne fizzing in his glass. The room erupted with applause. Laughter bounced off the walls. But not a single head turned in my direction. That flawless uptime. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was me. I was the one rebooting servers at 3 in the morning while my wife rolled over in bed alone. I was the one patching code while sitting in a dentist's chair, one hand clutching my jaw, the other tapping furiously on a laptop balanced across my knees. I was the one keeping our product from crashing in front of high-stakes clients, while others strutted on stage smiling in perfectly pressed suits. In that crowded ballroom with blinking Christmas lights strung along the ceiling, I stood off to the side holding a flat soda, and it hit me. I was the ghost in the machine. The product bore the company's name, but the blood pumping through its veins was mine. My fingerprints were in every update, my sweat in every fix. And yet, when things went right, the applause belonged to someone else. When things went wrong, I was the one shoved into the hot seat, a human shield, while everyone else escaped blame. That night, the smirk on my boss's face burned itself into my memory. Mark, our department head, leaned against the bar like he owned the place, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He thrived on the imbalance my labor feeding his reputation. He didn't need to shout or pound the table. He could kill your confidence with a single arched eyebrow, with a single question spoken in front of everyone. So, why didn't you think of that earlier? Sharp enough to sting all day, subtle enough you couldn't fight back. I remember one particular moment, our quarterly review, when he looked right at me and chuckled. If Daniel ever left, the platform would crumble for about 5 minutes before we replaced him with a cheaper contractor. Everyone laughed. What else could they do? He signed their paychecks. I forced a smile, but deep down, I filed that moment away. I kept a whole drawer full of those moments, cataloged like evidence. And one day I knew I'd need them. But here's the thing about being invisible. Sometimes invisibility is cover. While Mark basked in applause that wasn't his, while executives congratulated themselves on my sleepless nights, I was already working on something else. Something quiet, something they didn't even know existed. And before I go further, before I tell you exactly how I turned their arrogance into their undoing, I want to pause for just a second. Because right now you're hearing my side of the story, raw and unfiltered. If you're listening and you've ever felt like the ghost in someone else's machine, don't just pass by, tell me where you're watching from, share your story, and subscribe. It's voices like yours that keep stories like mine alive. Now back to that holiday party. Back to Mark's smirk, to the laughter at my expense. In that moment, I realized something chilling and liberating all at once. They didn't know the game I was really playing. They thought I was their safe pair of hands, their dependable fixer. They didn't know that 2 years earlier, in the quiet hours past midnight, I had started laying the foundation for a future where I wouldn't just fix their messes. I'd hold the very card that could topple their empire. I raised my flat soda in mock salute, a ghost at their feast, already planning the day I'd make them see me. I used to think being invisible was just part of the job. That maybe the best engineers, the ones who quietly held the walls from crumbling, were destined to be shadows. But shadows don't get thanked. Shadows don't get credit. They just absorb blow after blow until the day someone decides they're expendable. For years, that was me. Daniel, the dependable one. The guy who never raised his voice in meetings, who always had a laptop ready when a server went belly up at 2 in the morning. My phone would light up in the dark, my wife stirring beside me, whispering, "Again." I'd kiss her forehead, mumble an apology, and shuffle to the kitchen table. There I'd sit staring into the bluish glow of cascading error logs, typing like a surgeon under pressure, buying the company a future while my family lost pieces of me one night at a time. It became routine. Birthday candles extinguished because I was on a call. A missed Thanksgiving dinner because the system went critical right before dessert. Even the birth of my second child, half the time I was glued to my phone answering frantic pings from colleagues who didn't know how to stop a cascading crash. And the cruelest part. The next morning, I'd show up to work, exhausted, eyes burning, only to see someone else presenting the solution, as if it had been theirs all along. That's when I began to understand something brutal. In that office, credit wasn't earned, it was taken. And Mark was the master thief. He'd waltz into a technical meeting, halfway absorb half a sentence, then vanish for a client call. But when the project shipped there, he was on the front page of the company newsletter, smiling in front of a whiteboard full of my handwriting. Afterward, he'd pat me on the shoulder like a coach congratulating a water boy. "You're a real team player." The words stung worse than if he'd said nothing at all. Being invisible meant safety, or so I thought. If no one noticed me, no one could target me. But safety has a cost. Over time, I realized I was becoming the office ghost, the guy people only saw when things were on fire. Nobody invited me out for Friday happy hours anymore. I stopped going after realizing loose words had a way of finding their way back to Mark, twisted into ammunition. At meetings, I'd sit at the far end of the table, notebook, open eyes, lowered, scribbling ideas I knew he'd claim as his soon enough. Still, I didn't quit. I told myself my paycheck bought stability. I convinced myself recognition didn't matter. But every time Mark smirked across the room, every time I saw another exec beam at him for something I'd built, the fire inside me grew hotter. The truth was, I wasn't powerless. I was simply biding my time. Because while they ignored me, I was quietly building something bigger. I was learning to see the board the way Mark thought only he could. He moved people like chess pieces, freezing out anyone who resisted until they quit. But I wasn't just a pawn. I was the ghost in the machine, watching, recording, preparing. And here's where I need to pause, because if you've ever been in that position, giving everything and getting nothing, you know how heavy silence can feel. Drop a comment below and tell me if you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been the invisible one in the room. I promise you're not alone, and your story matters. Back in the office, I became the one people turned to at 2 a.m. when disaster struck. And each time I saved the day, I caught Mark's smirk across the table, the silent acknowledgement that he'd just pocketed another win off my back. Outwardly, I told myself it didn't matter. But deep down, every quiet fix, every ignored sacrifice became another brick in the wall I was building. They thought I was just keeping the gears turning. What they didn't know was that I was laying down the pieces of my own plan, a plan that, when revealed, would turn that smirk into something else entirely. Being invisible had its uses, and I was about to show them that sometimes the ghost in the machine is the one pulling the strings. Mark wasn't the kind of boss who needed to yell. He never slammed his fist on the table or raised his voice in front of clients. That would have been too obvious, too crude for a man who thrived on control. No, his weapon of choice was something quieter, sharper, subtle ridicule that left bruises nobody else could see. I remember the way he'd enter a meeting, late of course, carrying a coffee he didn't pay for, leaning back in his leather chair like a king observing his court. He wouldn't address me directly at first. He'd let the team discuss, let me lay out a solution in detail, let the gears start turning. Then he'd tilt his head, raise one eyebrow, and say the line he loved most. "So, Daniel, why didn't you think of that earlier?" It was surgical. A single question that made everything I had just explained sound like an afterthought. Laughter would ripple around the room, not because it was funny, but because laughter was survival in Mark's kingdom. And me, I'd force a polite chuckle, all while filing the moment away in the same mental cabinet where I stored every slight, every cut, every reminder of how disposable he thought I was. That's who Mark was, a master of microcuts. He didn't need to swing a hammer when he could bleed you dry with 1,000 paper cuts. He lived for the imbalance, the knowledge that his smirk alone could deflate you for the rest of the day. And the worst part, everyone played along. Because if they didn't, they'd become his next target. I watched him do it more than once, freezing out a senior developer by rerouting every project away from her desk until she had nothing left. She quit 2 months later, and Mark had the audacity to act surprised. "She didn't even give notice," he said, shaking his head. "People these days know loyalty." His words dripped with mock disappointment, but his eyes, they gleamed with victory. Mark wasn't managing a department, he was playing chess. And every one of us was just another piece on his board. Pawns to be sacrificed, knights to be maneuvered, queens to be sidelined the moment they threatened his king. He didn't care if we liked him. He didn't even care if we respected him. What he wanted, what he demanded, was that we remember who controlled the game. And I'll admit, for a long time he had me fooled. I thought maybe that was just the way the corporate world worked, that maybe being humiliated in public was just part of paying your dues. But the longer I stayed in his orbit, the more I realized something chilling. Mark wasn't building anything. He wasn't innovating. He wasn't even leading. He was a parasite feeding on the work of others, dressing it up in buzzwords, and selling it to executives who didn't know better. The only thing Mark ever built was fear, and I'll never forget the quarterly review when he decided to take his biggest swing at me yet. The room was packed executives HR, the kind of audience that could shape careers with a single glance. My performance review was stellar, every metric off the charts. But then with that same lazy smirk, Mark leaned forward and said, "If Daniel ever left the platform, might crumble," for about 5 minutes before we replaced him with a cheaper contractor. The room erupted with laughter. The executives chuckled, HR chuckled, even some of my peers chuckled. And me, I smiled too. But inside, something snapped. Because in that moment, I knew what Mark didn't. I wasn't just another pawn. I had been quietly building something far more powerful than his smug little smirks. Something that one day would flip the entire board over. But for now, I kept my head down. I swallowed the humiliation, filed it away with all the rest, and let Mark believe he'd won. Because sometimes the best move is the one your opponent never sees coming. The thing about men like Mark is that they don't just play the game, they rewrite the rules so no one else can win. He didn't build teams, he moved pieces. People weren't colleagues to him. They were assets to control, to reposition, to discard when their usefulness ran out. I learned that lesson the hard way. There was a senior developer named Carla, one of the sharpest minds I'd ever worked with. She had a knack for spotting system flaws weeks before they turned into outages. But Mark, he didn't like her confidence. She spoke directly, didn't sugarcoat her assessments, and worse, executives listened when she talked. That was a threat. So piece by piece, he dismantled her career. First, he reassigned her flagship project to someone else, citing resource realignment. Then, he kept her off key client calls. When she tried to speak up in meetings, he cut her off, redirecting the conversation as if her voice didn't exist. Within 3 months, Carla was invisible, and soon after she was gone. Mark played it cool, shaking his head at her resignation notice. Some people just can't handle the pace, he told us, but I saw the gleam in his eyes. He hadn't lost a developer, he'd eliminated a rival. Watching Carla walk out with her box of personal things, I realized something chilling that could just as easily be me, and in a way it already was. See, Mark had a different strategy for me. I wasn't outspoken like Carla. I wasn't a threat in the boardroom. No, my value was in my silence. I was the dependable one, the fixer, the midnight lifeline. He needed me, but only as a tool. The safer pair of hands, the one who could be paraded around as the team player. He didn't freeze me out, he chained me in place. That's the brilliance of Mark's game. He didn't need loyalty, only obedience. He didn't care if you respected him. He just needed you to doubt yourself enough to let him keep control. His kingdom thrived on imbalance. Fear was his currency, and humiliation was his weapon. It was a slow burn for me. Every smirk, every stolen idea, every team player pat on the shoulder added weight to the fire building inside. But I never stormed out. I never shouted back. That wasn't my style. Instead, I watched. I listened. I filed everything away. Because unlike Carla, I had something he didn't know about. Something he couldn't freeze out or reassign. I kept my composure through those endless 12-hour days, the late-night calls, the stolen weekends. And every time I saw him step in front of a whiteboard covered in my handwriting, claiming credit for breakthroughs he didn't even understand, I told myself, let him have this moment, because one day there will be a moment he can't touch. And when that day came, it wouldn't just bruise his ego, it would shake the entire foundation he thought he controlled. But until then, I let him believe he was the chess master. I played the pawn, I stayed quiet, I waited. Because the thing about pawns is this: under the right circumstances, they don't just survive the board, they become something else entirely. And Mark never saw it coming. The morning it finally happened felt almost too ordinary. A Tuesday. Of course, it's always a Tuesday when the knife comes down. Tuesdays sit in that strange purgatory, too far from Friday to hope, too close to Monday to fight. I was at my desk, untangling a catastrophic memory leak that had been draining server performance for months. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands cramped, but I'd done it, I'd stopped the bleeding. A fix that would save the company millions. I leaned back for the first time in hours, staring at the screen with that quiet satisfaction only engineers understand. And then I saw her, Mark's assistant. She hovered at my cubicle, tapping her tablet like she was double-checking a death sentence. Her eyes slid away from mine as she said, "Mark wants to see you in his office. HR will be there." I knew instantly what that meant. In our company, Mark plus HR wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. Walking across the open floor to Mark's corner office felt like walking on stage. Every keyboard click slowed. Every whispered conversation dipped into silence. People pretended to work, but their eyes followed me. I'd seen it happen to others. Now it was my turn. Mark was waiting ankle-propped casually over his knee posture, relaxed like a man closing a routine sale. Beside him sat an HR rep with a folder on her lap, smiling that professional smile that meant she'd already decided my fate. "Let's get right to it," Mark began, voice smooth, practiced. "We're making some changes in the department. Unfortunately, that means we're going to have to let you go." The words floated in the air, sterile final. HR slid the termination packet across the desk with the grace of a maitre d' presenting a fine meal. "Effective immediately," she added. And then came the flourish. Mark's lips curved into the smirk I knew too well. He leaned forward and said, "You can collect your plant when facilities approves." The way he said it, like the plant. The tiny bit of green life I'd kept alive through 2 office moves and 1 brutal winter was a privilege I'd have to beg for, was pure Mark. Petty, calculated, humiliating. I looked at him, then glanced over my shoulder toward the small plant still sitting on my desk. A humble little thing, nothing more than leaves in a pot. But to Mark it was the perfect symbol for the final insult. His way of saying you were nothing more than decoration here. And you know what? I didn't give him the satisfaction. I nodded once, tucked the folder under my arm, and stood. "All right," I said evenly. "I'll get out of your way." The walk back to my desk was the same as the walk to his office. Hushed whispers, sidelong glances, people pretending not to watch the show they'd all been waiting for. I slid my laptop into its case, placed my badge on top, and zipped the bag shut. The sound echoed louder than I expected, like a trap snapping closed. No one spoke. No one said sorry to hear or good luck, and I didn't expect them to. In Mark's world, showing sympathy to someone walking out the door was like painting a target on your own back. I'd seen it happen before, but inside I wasn't hollow. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't rehearsing my resume or calculating how I'd pay the mortgage. No, inside I was steady, calm. Because while Mark thought he'd just written the final chapter of my story, I knew better. This wasn't an ending. It was a pivot. And as I walked out, I thought about the thick folder waiting in my home desk drawer. The folder filled with signed documents, attorney's notes, and 1 crisp patent certificate with my name on it. Mark thought he'd buried me with that petty plant insult. But all he'd really done was water the roots of a plant I'd planted long before. And speaking of plants, let me ask you something. If you were in my shoes, fired, after years of sacrifice, mocked with a plant on your way out, would you have walked away quietly, or would you have fought back? Tell me in the comments, because I promise you, your answer might surprise you as much as mine did. Because this wasn't over, not even close. The moment I stepped out of that glass-walled office with my badge on the desk and my plant left behind, Mark thought he'd won. He thought the smirk on his face was the period at the end of my story. But what he didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that my real story had been in motion for 2 years already. It started on a night like so many others. My apartment was dim, the clock past 1:30 a.m., half-eaten Chinese takeout on the desk, and a notebook crammed with half-scribbled equations and system diagrams. While the company slept, I was awake chasing an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. The kind of idea that follows you into the shower, interrupts your thoughts in the grocery store, and keeps you staring at the ceiling long after midnight. See, I'd been studying the way our system handled data, watching inefficiencies pile up like junk in an attic. Loops inside loops. Bloated processes nobody wanted to touch because they worked fine. But fine was bleeding us dry extra cloud storage bills. Wasted CPU cycles, customer lag we pretended not to see. And then it clicked. A different approach, lean and efficient one, that cut resource usage by nearly 1/3 without sacrificing performance. It wasn't rocket science, it was elegance. I could explain it to a junior dev in under a minute. But to replicate it from scratch, it would take competitors years. When the code finally compiled, when the output came back clean and fast, I just sat there staring at the screen. It felt like I'd discovered a secret door in a house I'd lived in for years. Something so obvious once you saw it, and yet invisible to everyone else. I knew exactly what I had. And more importantly, I knew it wasn't the company's. I hadn't touched their servers, hadn't written a single line on their machines. Every keystroke had been on my own laptop in my own apartment, on my own time. It was mine, entirely mine. Within a week, I filed a provisional patent. My name timestamped, stamped into the legal record. A flag planted in the soil, daring anyone to try and move it. I didn't tell Mark, I didn't tell anyone. Better to keep it quiet like a seed in the ground. Months later, the company accidentally stumbled onto pieces of my idea. I'd mentioned the concept in passing to another engineer over lunch, and somehow fragments of it showed up in production code. Not my exact work, but close enough that I recognized my fingerprints. It wasn't theft, not technically, but it was parasitic. They had no idea the ground beneath them already belonged to me. When I tried to raise it with legal, they brushed me off. Since you haven't commercialized it independently, it's not really relevant. One lawyer muttered, not even looking up from his laptop. Translation: if it wasn't making them money, it wasn't worth their time. But I knew better. I kept records. Every time they pushed another update using my method, every deployment that leaned on my design, I logged it. I wasn't planning revenge then, not yet. I was building insurance. By the time Mark smirked across the table and told me I could collect my plant, that insurance policy had grown into a weapon. A real one. Because what Mark couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that the chessboard he thought he owned wasn't his anymore. I wasn't his pawn. I was holding the piece that could flip the whole board upside down. And here's where I want to stop for just a moment. Because maybe you've had an idea like that, something you built in silence, something no one believed in. Tell me, have you ever created something on your own time, only to watch others dismiss it? Or worse, use it without giving you credit? Share your story below. Because trust me, I know how that burn feels. The difference for me was simple. I had the receipts, my name on the patent, my proof stamped in black ink. So when Mark thought he'd written my ending with that smug little plant insult, the truth was, he'd just watered the roots of something far bigger. Because the seed I planted years ago was ready to grow, and it was about to choke out his entire empire. What none of them realized, what made me smile to myself in the quiet moments, was that the company had already shackled itself to me without even knowing it. 18 months. That's how long they'd been baking my design into everything they touched. What started as a few experimental tweaks became the foundation of half the tools we sold to clients. Back-end processes, client dashboards, even the shiny new features Mark boasted about at tech conferences, they all ran on the framework I had built in my apartment at 1:30 in the morning. I remember the first time I saw it in action. We were running a demo for a major client, executives crowding the room. The system hummed along smoother than it ever had, and Mark stood at the front, grinning like a conquering general. He couldn't explain why it was so efficient, he didn't need to. All he needed was my work quietly humming beneath the surface while he claimed the victory. That day I smiled too, not because of Mark's performance, but because I knew something no one else in that room did. The ground beneath them wasn't theirs. It was mine. Every update they rolled out, every new client-facing feature, every press release bragging about cutting-edge efficiency, all of it rested on technology that didn't belong to them. I logged everything. Screenshots, timestamps, deployment notes. I built a paper trail thick enough to smother their denials before they even started. It wasn't about revenge back then, not yet. It was about certainty. About knowing that while Mark moved his chess pieces around the board, I had already hidden a queen behind his king. The beauty of it was how invisible it all seemed. To them, it was just code, just a method. They never asked where it came from or how it worked so seamlessly. They just used it, bragged about it, cashed in on it. And with every brag, every dollar earned, they tightened the rope around their own necks. I kept my silence. I kept working the same 12-hour days, showing up at 2 a.m., when systems buckled, patching fires, before they hit the headlines. Outwardly, I was the dependable ghost. But inside, I knew the truth. They were building their empire on borrowed ground. And one day the rent would come due. Mark strutted through the halls like a king convinced he controlled the board. He'd clap me on the back after a big launch, his smirk practically glowing. "You're the backbone of this place, Daniel," he'd say loud enough for the interns to hear. And then, in the same breath, he'd remind me that nobody was irreplaceable. But he was wrong. He was dead wrong. Because by then I wasn't just another cog in his machine. I was the machine. I didn't rush. That's the thing about leverage, you don't waste it on small wins. You wait. You let the dependency grow so deep, so tangled, that by the time you pull the pin, the whole thing collapses in on itself. For 18 months, I let them dig deeper. For 18 months, I watched Mark's ego inflate with every keynote, every interview, every pat on the back from upper management. And for 18 months, I let him believe I was invisible. But the truth, I was never invisible. I was essential. And one day, the man who mocked me with a plant would realize just how dangerous it is to build your empire on someone else's roots. The first time I slid that thick folder across the table to Victor, I felt something shift. Not just in the room, but in me. Victor wasn't like the company's lawyers. He wasn't distracted typing emails while pretending to listen. He was an intellectual property attorney I'd known for years, a man who could read patent language the way a cardiologist reads an X-ray. Sharp, precise, ruthless when he needed to be. We sat in a cramped conference room at his firm, the kind with filing cabinets older than the paralegal who brought me coffee. My hands rested on the folder I'd been building for 2 years, commit logs, timestamps, draft code diagrams, the provisional patent I'd filed in my own name long before Mark thought he could cut me loose. It's time, I told him. Victor didn't need clarification. He knew exactly what I meant. He opened the folder, flipping through page after page, his brow furrowing deeper with every turn. Finally, he looked up. "You wrote every line of this outside of work hours?" he asked. "Every single line, on my own hardware, no overlap with their code base. I've got receipts for everything." He nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. "Good. Because once we file this as a full patent, there's no walking it back. You'll own it outright. No company claim no shared rights. If they're already using it..." He let the sentence trail off, but I didn't need him to finish. I knew exactly what it meant. If they were already using my design, they were already in violation. For the next 3 hours, we carved the language down to its sharpest edge. Every clause that might give the company an opening was ripped out and replaced with airtight phrasing. Victor was meticulous, dissecting sentences, testing hypotheticals, making sure the patent wasn't just defensible, it was untouchable. We clarified everything that the algorithm had been developed independently, without company resources, without overlap, without shared ownership. We added explicit statements that any incidental use of it in other products without licensing would constitute infringement. The phrasing wasn't just defensive, it was offensive. By the time Victor slid the final draft across the table, I felt the tension in my chest harden into something colder, more deliberate. This wasn't insurance anymore. This was a loaded weapon. Once it was filed, there would be no doubt. The technology they had been bragging about, the framework that powered their products, the code Mark paraded as his own innovation, it would all trace back to me, legally, unshakably. I signed the papers in ink that bled slightly into the fibers. My name, my claim, my move. Victor leaned back, watching me. "You realize what this means, right? The moment this patent is public, every update they push that relies on your design is another nail in their coffin." I nodded, then let them keep building. Because that was the beauty of leverage. You don't waste it on a shouting match or a bruised ego. You save it for the moment when the stakes are so high, the collapse so public that no one can recover. Walking out of that law office, patent documents, filed confirmation emails already pinging my inbox. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, focused, like I'd finally moved my piece into position. Mark thought he was the chess master. He thought he'd put me in check with that smug little meeting in his office. But he never saw the trap I'd been setting, the quiet landmine buried under every bragging press release. And soon he'd realize what it meant to step on it. The Tuesday they thought they ended me was the Tuesday I'd been preparing for. Mark leaned back in his corner office chair, ankle crossed over his knee like he was about to close a deal instead of gut a man's career. HR sat beside him, folder, poised, her smile just a little too polished. She didn't need to speak. The papers already spoke for her. "We're making changes," Mark said smoothly, almost like he was pitching a client. "Unfortunately, that means we're going to have to let you go." I watched his lips curl into that familiar smirk, the one that had followed me for years. And then came his dagger. "You can collect your plant when facilities approves." That was supposed to be my humiliation. The petty little flourish that sealed his power over me. I didn't flinch. I didn't rage. I didn't even argue. I just tucked the folder under my arm, nodded once, and stood. "All right," I said, voice even. "I'll get out of your way." Walking back across the office floor was like moving through a theater. Heads lifted, fingers froze on keyboards, conversations dipped into whispers. Everyone had seen this play before, just never with me in the starring role. At my desk, I slid my laptop into its case, set my badge on top, and zipped it shut. The sound echoed like a trap snapping closed. No one said a word. No sympathy, no good lucks. And I didn't expect them to. In Mark's kingdom, showing kindness to the condemned was a risk no one wanted to take. But inside, I wasn't broken. I wasn't panicked about rent or bills or job searches. I was calm, too calm. Because unlike Mark, I knew the truth. This wasn't the final act. This was the pivot. As I stepped out of the building, I thought about the folder in my desk drawer at home, signed documents, attorney's notes, a full patent with my name printed in black ink. The foundation of the company's empire wasn't theirs. It was mine. And they'd been building higher and higher on borrowed ground. Mark thought his smirk was checkmate. He didn't realize he'd just moved his king into check without even knowing it. I drove home that night in silence, headlights slicing through wet asphalt. My bag sat in the passenger seat, termination packet shoved to the bottom. I didn't touch it. It wasn't worth my time. Because while Mark was sipping victory in his glass office, I already knew what came next. And here's where I'm going to stop for just a second, because what happened after that Tuesday wasn't just a twist. It was the moment everything flipped upside down. If you're still with me, don't go anywhere. What you're about to hear isn't just about revenge. It's about how one move, one phone call turned their empire into rubble. Stay with me, because the real storm hadn't even begun. That night, while the company congratulated itself for trimming dead weight, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and my laptop open. My reflection in the darkened glass looked calm, steady. Mark thought he'd cut me loose. What he didn't know was that I was already free. And freedom in the right hands is dangerous. That night, after the silence of my apartment had settled in, I pushed Mark's termination packet aside like it was yesterday's trash. It lay crumpled on the corner of my table, irrelevant compared to the open laptop glowing in front of me. I scrolled through my contacts until I landed on a name I hadn't called in years, Ellen Ray, Vice President of Product at one of our biggest competitors. I'd first met her at an industry conference in Denver back when I was still naive enough to think hard work alone could earn recognition. We'd shared drinks after a keynote trading jokes about overpriced lanyards and clumsy demo failures. But beneath the banter, I saw what made Ellen different. She was sharp, strategic. She had the kind of eye that spotted opportunity like a hawk circling from above. And I knew exactly how she'd see this one. My cursor hovered over her number for just a second before I pressed dial. The call rang twice, and then her voice came through calm, curious. "Well, well," she said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "No small talk, no warm-up. I've got something you're going to want to see," I told her. Silence on the line, then a slow, amused "go on." I laid it out in sharp, simple strokes. An independently developed algorithm, full patent, airtight legal language, every timestamp and receipt clean. A technology her competitor, my old company, had been using every single day without legal rights. Her tone shifted instantly. The casual warmth vanished, replaced by steel. "Send me the filings." I attached the documents to an encrypted email while we stayed on the line. A minute later, I could hear the faint rustle of papers, though I knew she was scrolling PDFs. "It's clean," she muttered half to herself. "And they've been using this for how long?" 18 months, maybe more. It's in their core products. Pull it out and their back end grinds to a halt. I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "You looking to license it exclusively?" "Exclusively," I said, "and fast." From there, it was all business. We talked terms in broad strokes, licensing fees, exclusivity windows, non-disclosure clauses. Ellen didn't haggle much. She didn't need to. She knew speed was the real currency here. Every hour that passed before the deal closed was another hour my old company might stumble across the ticking time bomb under their feet. But they wouldn't. They were too busy congratulating themselves for getting rid of me. By the time we hung up, it was after midnight. Ellen's legal department was already spinning email threads piling up like poker chips. They were moving fast, faster than I'd even dared to hope. I sat back in my chair staring at the ceiling. I didn't feel giddy. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was steadiness, precision, like I had just moved a piece across the board and knew without a doubt that the game was no longer winnable for the other side. For years, Mark had treated me like a pawn, disposable, replaceable. But pawns have a funny habit in chess. If they survive long enough, if they reach the other side of the board, they transform. They become something powerful, something unstoppable. And tonight, with one phone call, I had crossed the board. What Ellen and I set in motion that night wasn't revenge fireworks. It was quieter, more surgical. The kind of move that didn't just topple a king, it rewrote the game entirely. If there's one thing people underestimate about corporate warfare, it's speed. Not headlines, not drama speed. Moves made before the other side even realizes a game has started. Within 72 hours of that late-night call, Ellen's team had done what most companies couldn't manage in a quarter. They closed the deal. Her lawyers shredded the documents I'd given them, line by line, testing for cracks, confirming dates, verifying I hadn't leaned on company hardware or resources. When they couldn't find a flaw, they didn't hesitate. By Thursday morning, I was sitting across from Ellen in her glass-walled office overlooking downtown San Francisco. She slid a contract across the table so thick it could have stopped a bullet. I picked up the pen, my name already printed on every page, and signed. Just like that, my patent was no longer just mine. It was a weapon licensed exclusively to her company. And Ellen knew exactly how to fire it. We're going public, she told me, eyes locked on mine. Not with lawsuits yet, not with lawyers, with truth. I nodded. It was the perfect first strike. A press release announcing their exclusive licensing of a revolutionary algorithm. The wording was elegant, careful, just enough detail to draw attention, just enough ambiguity to let the industry connect the dots on its own. By Friday morning, the statement hit every major tech outlet. TechCrunch, Wired, The Wall Street Journal. Headlines blared about Ellen's company securing rights to a breakthrough framework designed to reshape back-end efficiency across the sector. The press release didn't mention my old company by name. It didn't need to. Because within hours, engineers and analysts across Silicon Valley were dissecting the news. They knew what products Ellen's competitor had been flaunting. They knew what kind of framework those products relied on. And they knew without a shadow of doubt that those frameworks matched the description in Ellen's release. By lunch, social media was on fire. Twitter threads popped up connecting screenshots of my old company's code presentations with phrases pulled straight from the press statement. On LinkedIn, ex-employees were whispering what they'd seen in private Slack channels that the innovation Mark had bragged about for months was already in legal quicksand. Inside their headquarters, I could imagine the panic. Mark in his office, jaw tight, calling emergency meetings. HR shredding documents, leadership firing off emails at 2 a.m. Their lawyers scrambling to draft denials while investors demanded answers. I didn't need to see it, I could feel it. Because here's the truth about empires built on theft. They don't fall with a roar. They crumble in whispers first, rumors, doubts, questions asked in boardrooms and back channels. And once those cracks spread, there's no way to patch them fast enough. That Friday night, Ellen's company celebrated quietly in their own offices. Champagne corks, low laughter, the hum of victory. But me, I wasn't celebrating. I sat at home phone, buzzing with alerts from industry feeds, and I just breathed. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of silence. The world finally knew what I'd known all along, that I wasn't just another engineer tossed aside by a careless CEO. I was the architect of the very thing they thought they owned. And now everyone knew it. But here's the thing, this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the explosion. It was just the fuse. Because once the lawsuit started, once Discovery opened their files to the world, the real fireworks would begin. And trust me, you're going to want to see that part. Don't look away now. I leaned back in my chair phone, buzzing with Ellen's team, confirming next steps, and smiled for the first time in weeks. The game wasn't just turning, it had already turned. By Monday morning, the storm had already reached a fever pitch. News anchors were repeating Ellen's press release like it was scripture. Analysts were calculating the billions at stake, and inside the company I'd once given everything to chaos reigned. I didn't have to be in their offices to know it. Friends still trapped in that building were quietly sending me updates, emergency meetings every 2 hours, investors on calls screaming about exposure. Mark hasn't slept. He looks like he's aged 10 years in 3 days. And then came the email leak. Someone forwarded me a chain mark writing at 3:17 a.m., barking at legal to shut down the narrative and ordering engineers to scrub every presentation deck for references. The desperation practically dripped off the screen. It was confirmation of everything I'd predicted. The empire wasn't cracking slowly anymore, it was caving in. But here's where it got interesting. They weren't just panicking about Ellen's announcement, they were panicking about me. Because by now whispers had turned into names. My name. The patent filings were public record, and journalists had connected the dots. Articles weren't just about Ellen's company anymore, they were about me, the former employee cut loose only days before the licensing bombshell dropped. Suddenly, every outlet wanted a quote. Every podcast wanted me on their show. Mark hated nothing more than losing control of the narrative, and now he'd lost it completely. The irony was delicious. The man who thought firing me was the ultimate humiliation was now watching my face appear on industry blogs, LinkedIn feeds, and even a CNBC segment. The engineer who held the cards, they called me. Inside his office, Mark was spiraling. He'd built his kingdom on image, on the illusion of genius, the cult of personality. But with one deal, I had shattered the mask. And worse, his board knew it. By Wednesday, half of them were quietly reaching out to Ellen's camp hedging bets, trying to protect their own reputations before the collapse became irreversible. And here's the part that kept me up at night, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because everything so far, the headlines, the leaks, the investor panic, that was just the opening act. The real twist was still hidden, buried in the documents Ellen and I hadn't yet revealed. Things I'd kept quiet even from her legal team until the time was right. Proof that Mark hadn't just stolen my work, he'd knowingly lied to regulators, to investors, and to federal contracts worth hundreds of millions. That wasn't just a corporate scandal, that was fraud, criminal fraud. And the moment we pulled the pin on that grenade, the blast radius would stretch far beyond Mark's corner office. So if you're listening right now, don't blink. Because what comes next isn't just the fall of one man, it's the unraveling of an entire culture built on greed, arrogance, and theft. And when the twist drops, you're going to see just how fast a king can lose his crown. That week, I stayed quiet in public. No interviews, no flashy statements. I let the storm build on its own. The silence was strategic. Let them scramble. Let them exhaust themselves with denial after denial, while I sat back and waited with documents that could turn panic into full-blown collapse. I could almost picture Mark pacing his office phone in hand, wondering why I hadn't spoken yet. Wondering if maybe, just maybe, I'd already fired my biggest shot. He had no idea the real weapon was still waiting, and soon everyone would know. The funny thing about secrets is that they don't stay buried, not when paper trails exist. And Mark, for all his arrogance, he left fingerprints everywhere. I still remember the first time I stumbled across the files. Months earlier, back when I was still on the inside, I'd been combing through archived contracts to debug a compliance issue. That's when I found a folder tucked into a mislabeled directory hidden in plain sight. Inside were invoices and reports sent to a federal agency, all tied to the very framework I had designed. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Numbers that didn't add up, dates that didn't match. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Mark hadn't just stolen my work, he had repackaged it, slapped false certification dates on it, and sold it under the company's banner for multi-million-dollar government deals. That wasn't just theft, that was fraud at the highest level. I copied everything quietly, carefully. Dozens of PDFs, email chains, signed attestations with Mark's name sprawled across the bottom. I tucked them into an encrypted drive, never sure if I'd ever use them, but unwilling to delete them. They were insurance. And now, months later, they weren't just insurance. They were dynamite. When I showed Ellen the files, she didn't blink. She called in her legal counsel, then her compliance team, and within hours they were huddled around a conference table like generals reviewing battle plans. The room buzzed with a single realization: this wasn't just a civil case anymore. This was criminal. But here's the twist, the part Mark never saw coming. Ellen didn't want to rush this into court. She wanted to weaponize it strategically. We leak this now, she told me, and it'll dominate the news cycle for a week. But if we let the feds dig in first, if we let subpoenas drop, raids happen, indictments land, Mark won't just lose his company, he'll lose his freedom. I sat there staring at the mountain of evidence in front of us and felt a strange calm wash over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. About making sure that people like Mark, who thought they could burn through lives and careers without consequence, finally paid the price. And so the plan shifted. Ellen's lawyers quietly forwarded the files to the Department of Justice and the agency's Inspector General. Not with a press release, not with fanfare, just a careful, calculated delivery of truth. Within weeks, subpoenas began to fly. Quiet visits from federal investigators, questions whispered in hallways. The kind of slow, suffocating scrutiny that chokes even the most confident executive. Mark thought he'd weathered the worst with the headlines. He had no idea the real storm was only just forming. And here's where I'll pause because the next step isn't just about corporate collapse, it's about federal agents' indictments and a takedown so public it made the evening news. If you think you've seen arrogance destroyed before, wait until you hear how fast the walls closed in once the truth became evidence. Stay with me, you won't want to miss this. That night, sitting at my kitchen table again, I scrolled through the encrypted files one last time. His signature, his lies, his empire built on sand. I closed the laptop and whispered to myself, "It's over, Mark. You just don't know it yet." The morning it all went public, I woke up to my phone buzzing like a hornet's nest. Dozens of notifications stacked on top of each other, news alerts, missed calls, text messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. I opened the first headline and nearly laughed. Federal investigation targets tech giant over fraudulent contracts. The next one was even sharper, CEO accused of defrauding U.S. government. DOJ confirms active probe. Mark's face was everywhere. Not the glossy, backlit portraits he'd paid photographers for, but grainy shots of him looking furious as he ducked into a black SUV. Suddenly, the man who thrived on controlling his image couldn't control anything. By mid-morning, cable networks were running panel discussions dissecting every angle. How long has this been going on? What did the board know? Could indictments be coming? And then came the footage, federal agents walking through the glass doors of headquarters, box after box carried out. Employees standing frozen as laptops were unplugged, files seized. It wasn't just a raid, it was a spectacle. Inside sources fed reporters every detail. Secret meetings, compliance officers silenced, even bonuses tied directly to the fraudulent contracts. Each revelation shredded what little credibility the company had left. I couldn't resist flipping through LinkedIn. My old coworkers, people who hadn't even looked me in the eye on my way out, were now frantically updating their profiles, announcing new opportunities and career pivots. The rats weren't just leaving the ship, they were catapulting off before it sank. And Mark, for once he was silent. No fiery memos, no smug interviews. The man who loved to be on stage had vanished, holed up somewhere with a shrinking circle of lawyers. Every hour he stayed quiet, the speculation grew louder. That night, I finally agreed to an interview. Not on a podcast, not on a blog, but on primetime television. I wasn't there to gloat. I wasn't there to rub salt in the wound. I was there to tell the truth. I tried to do this the right way, I told the anchor, my voice steady. But when the people in power steal your work, silence your voice, and profit off lies, you don't just walk away, you fight back. Because if they'll do it to me, they'll do it to anyone. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. Comments poured in from engineers, interns, people from industries I'd never touched. They weren't just watching a scandal, they were seeing a blueprint for resistance. Proof that you didn't have to accept being crushed by the system. And right there in that moment, I realized the revenge was complete. Not because Mark was exposed, not because the DOJ was circling, but because the narrative was mine again. My voice, my story, my name, not his, defined the truth now. And let me leave you with this. If you've ever felt powerless, ever felt like your work or your worth was stolen by someone sitting higher up the chain, don't forget the story isn't over until you write the ending. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply surviving long enough to speak. And what comes next? That's the part you'll never see coming. Because as devastating as this collapse was, the final chapter hadn't been written yet. Mark's empire was burning, but the fire was about to consume more than just one man. It was about to ignite change across the whole industry. And I wasn't finished. Not yet. Mark's fall didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It unraveled piece by piece like a suit thread snagged on a nail until the entire garment collapsed around him. The indictment hit first. Headlines screamed across every major outlet, federal charges filed against CEO for fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud. His mugshot wasn't the polished executive portrait he'd curated for years. It was raw, unfiltered, and humiliating. His eyes were bloodshot, his smirk replaced by the unmistakable weight of reality. Court filings revealed everything. The falsified contracts, the diverted funds, the bonuses funneled through shell accounts. For years, Mark had built his empire on deception, and now, brick by brick, it was crumbling in full view of the public. Investors fled overnight. Stock prices nosedived, wiping out billions in market value within a week. By the end of the quarter, the board had dissolved. Entire divisions shuddered. What once felt like an untouchable giant was reduced to rubble scattered across bankruptcy filings and lawsuits. I thought I'd feel joy watching it burn. But the truth. What I felt most was relief. Relief that his shadow was gone. Relief that I no longer had to wake up wondering how far he'd go to destroy me. Relief that the truth was finally louder than his lies. One afternoon, months later, I walked past the now abandoned headquarters. The glass tower that once gleamed as a symbol of power now stood empty windows, dark lobby stripped bare. For a moment, I pressed my hand against the cool glass and whispered, "Checkmate." But this story isn't really about Mark, it never was. It's about survival. About refusing to let someone else write your ending. About standing back up even when the system tilts against you. I didn't just outlast him, I outlived his narrative. And here's the lesson I carry, the one I want you to carry too, when someone tries to erase you. The most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear. Sometimes revenge looks like lawsuits, headlines, or indictments. But sometimes the truest revenge is walking forward unbroken, while your enemies collapse under the weight of their own corruption. So if you're listening to this right now, maybe nodding along because you've felt that same helplessness, know this: you're not powerless. Your voice matters. Your work matters. Your story matters. And one day when you decide to claim it, you'll find strength you didn't know you had. Mark is gone. His empire is ash. But I'm still here, telling the story he tried to bury, breathing in freedom he thought he'd stolen, and building something new on foundations of truth this time. Before you go, let me ask you this. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Drop your thoughts below because I want to hear your stories. And if you've stayed with me this far, you already know this isn't the only story I've got. There's another twist, another reckoning waiting just around the corner. Don't miss it, stick around, hit subscribe, and come with me into the next chapter. Because trust me, you won't believe what happened next. And with that, I walked away from the empty building for the last time. The chapter was closed, the fire was out, and for the first time in years, the silence wasn't threatening. It was peace. When I finally stepped back from the chaos, I realized the real victory wasn't in watching Mark collapse, it was in reclaiming the quiet. For months, my life had been consumed by deadlines, legal calls, breaking news alerts, and the constant hum of adrenaline. And then one morning, I woke up, and it was just still. No buzzing phone, no subpoenas waiting in my inbox, just the sound of rain tapping softly against my window. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch watching the world carry on as if nothing had changed. Birds still sang, kids still laughed on their way to school. The world didn't pause because one empire fell, and that strangely was comforting. It reminded me that life is more than battles, more than headlines. Healing didn't come overnight. It came slowly in little rituals, morning walks without headphones, dinner with friends who stuck by me when things got ugly, rediscovering hobbies I had abandoned under the weight of survival. Every step away from the past was a step toward something gentler, something real. If there's one thing I want you to take with you, it's this. Don't let your scars convince you you're broken. They're proof you survived. Proof you stood when others wanted you silenced. Mark's story ended in ruin, but mine is still unfolding. And maybe yours is too. So write it. Live it. Choose peace over bitterness. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't fire, it's freedom. And that more than anything is the legacy I want to leave behind.